86. The Theology of Taxation. To affirm one Lord means to proclaim the sovereignty of God for every sphere of life and thought. It means, therefore, that all things are theological concerns, and to exempt any area of life from the government of God is to deny God. It is thus important to assert a theology of taxation. Taxation is an exercise of sovereignty and an attribute and power of God. The right to exact whatsoever he wills from all that he creates and to do as he wills is an aspect of sovereignty. St. Paul declared with respect to predestination, "Nay, but, O man, who art thou that repliest or disputest against God? Shall the thing formed say to him that formed it, Why hast thou made me thus?" Romans chapter 9, verse 20. This principle applies to every area. What God declares, man must accept. What God claims, man must yield. In origin, we are told taxation was of two kinds. First, by the gods, gradually exercised for them by divine rulers, and second, by brigands, who demanded protection money on threat of physical harm. This second form of taxation still continues as a criminal activity, as various criminal syndicates take over control of various areas of urban life. This form of taxation is also common to revolutionary movements. Thus, in Ethiopia, before its revolution, a daytime tax by the civil government and a nighttime tax by the revolutionists coexisted and placed people in many areas under a double tax. According to Seligman's theory of the development of taxation, state taxation by monarchs developed gradually and by indirection. As civilization gradually advances, private property develops, and the primitive equality slowly disappears. The interchange of commodities takes place on a larger scale. The old revenues are no longer adequate, and it becomes necessary for the monarch to supplement them by broadening the field of these compulsory contributions of service. In other words, the need of taxation arises. But a direct tax is still out of the question. Public opinion will not yet admit its necessity. The taxation of property is scarcely less impossible than the taxation of the person. It is regarded as a badge of disgrace for the freeman, a nota captivitas, as the Romans first called it, because only conquered enemies have to pay its arbitrary impost. The king, therefore, must endeavour to effect his objects covertly. He must go to work in a roundabout way and hide the tax in a variety of disguises. He either gradually extends his lucrative prerogatives or alleges that the charges are simple returns for government services. He grants protection or privileges to individuals and requires some payment in return. Thus begins the period of fees and charges, which the individuals are willing to pay and which gradually reconcile the public to the idea of governmental charges. Before long, however, the monarch feels able to throw off all disguises and limits the amount of his exactions only by the degree of his rapacity. Thus, the